Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to BUEI Talks Island SOS, Sustainable Ocean Strategies. My name is Dreas, your host for today's presentation. So this 8-part series focuses on innovative, sustainable ocean development initiatives in island nations around the world. Each presentation covers a different island and topic, highlights the unique perspective and involvement that islands have on ocean conservation, and showcases the different strategies and practices they've taken to safeguard our surrounding oceans. BUEI appreciates the generous support of Chubb Bermuda, the exclusive sponsor of this series. Island SOS aligns with Chubb's mission to promote a healthy and sustainable planet, strengthen the resilience of communities, and protect biodiversity against the effects of climate change. For our second Sustainable Ocean Strategy presentation, we're focusing on the Hawaiian Islands. Hawaii's proximity to the United States is uniquely comparable to Bermuda, being several hundred miles east of the United States. Other similarities to Bermuda include their tropical climate with a hot season from June to October, called Kau in the Hawaiian language, and a relatively cool season from December to March, Julio. Hawaii also imports a high percentage of their goods to their island, a major factor in waste management. Rafael Bergstrom, Executive Director of Sustainable Coastlines Hawaii, joins us today to share an approach his organization has developed to minimize waste created by events, whether large or small. So please join me in welcoming Rafael. Rafael, thank you so much for being here. We're really looking forward to your presentation. And before we get into that, we just want to open up with a question. So I definitely caught my eye seeing that your approach is applicable to events large and small. That's something that I'm super curious about here in Bermuda because we're hoping to reduce our waste. But even on a small scale, if you go to get takeout or a dinner for one, you're already generating a lot of waste. So it's sort of difficult to imagine scaling up to larger events. So I'm sure you'll cover this in your presentation, but why is it that you believe your strategies are applicable to events both large and small?
Oh, awesome question right off the bat. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. I mean, I think that we have to think about all the solutions in terms, especially with plastic waste, in terms of large and small. So if we can start with ourselves, whether it's at a small event that's just at our house in terms of being sustainable, then we can continue to scale up. And obviously, that's applicable in the context of island nations to larger continents too. And if we think small and locally, then we have the opportunity to figure out how that translates into larger settings.
Great. Thank you for that. And I'll, from here, turn it over to you and let you do your presentation. Thank you.
Awesome. All right. Aloha, everybody. I'm gonna share my screen here. Let's see here. Okay, can everybody see that, Andreas?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right. Well, as Andrea said, my name is Rafael Bergstrom. I'm the executive director for Sustainable Coastlines Hawaii. And while I am going to focus today on talking about our Sustain Events program, I also want to give a background on both who I am and who Sustainable Coastlines Hawaii is and the work that we do here in the Hawaiian Islands. So just starting off, I'll give a little introduction to myself. This picture in the middle is kind of how I feel doing this wonderful community work that is both, it makes you want to scream when you're working on these things, but it's also super exciting. So I wanted to bring that up. I've been a community organizer now for almost a decade with Sustainable Coastlines Hawaii and the Surfrider Foundation. Our whole mission is about bringing people together to inspire them to care for coastlines. I'm also a photographer, so some of the pictures that you see in here are ones that I've taken. This picture here, if you can see it, of the valley in Hawaii is the valley that I live in, Manoa Valley, and it really shows the context for both the wonderfulness and the challenges that Hawaii has with the proximity to ocean and mountains and dense urban development that's been happening over the last few decades too. All right. So I also wanted to just talk about context for Hawaii. Like Bermuda, I'm sure as well, there is a vision of Hawaii that tourism has, that people around the world have, and it might look like this to some people in some people's minds, of just this wonderful underwater oasis of beautiful reefs, of beautiful surf breaks, where people are just using the ocean as this incredible recreational playground, beautiful sunrises and sunsets, where everything is perfect and happy. Of course, that's not always the case, and the context of the work that we do more looks like this. And this is the same beach as that previous one that I just showed of the sunrise. And it is oftentimes covered in plastic pollution. And it goes on. This is another beach on one of our windward sides of Oahu, the most populated Hawaiian island. But this is actually not debris from Hawaii. This is marine debris from all over the world, all over the Pacific, and you see the remnants of both the convenience culture and then also of the commercial fishing industry that has had huge impacts on Hawaii. This is also what happens in Hawaii. This is land-based debris, so styrofoam containers, takeout containers, whether it's cups, lids, straws, all the things that you can think of. And it's the context for some of what I'm going to talk about today in Sustain Events, is trying to get rid of these from our systems. But this is just a stream that runs directly into the ocean in Hawaii. And we're also challenged with the other major concerns that are happening, especially in island nations around the world, in terms of sea level rise and coastal inundation, where houses are quite literally falling into the ocean as the seas continue to rise. So that's just to give context that yes, Hawaii is paradise as it may seem, but is afflicted with many of the problems that we are seeing growing around the world. So some context for our work too. As we continue to inspire communities to care for coastlines, we are known as a large-scale beach cleanup organization and have removed over 600,000 pounds of trash from Hawaii's coastlines in the last decade and united over 35,000 volunteers. We also have a very robust education program, connecting with over 45,000 students in classrooms, both here in Hawaii and globally now, as the pandemic has shifted some of our work online. We've been able to reach people all over the world. We've done almost 300 cleanups, given over 500 presentations, and through our social media and online programs have reached over 40 countries with our material. So again, before I get too deep into the events management, I wanted to talk about some of the framework of how we see both the problems and the opportunities for solutions that we have in this world. And we've restructured recently our education curriculum to think about it in these three buckets: that we've always been connected, that we've become disconnected, and we now have this opportunity to reconnect. And I'm going to go into a few concepts here in Hawaii that are really part of what we think of as connection. And Hawaii has an incredible, unique history of an indigenous culture that was very sustainable for thousands of years. And the concept of the ahupua'a is a really fascinating one that just talks about ridge to reef or Malkuta Makai management. So this drawing is thinking of traditional systems in Hawaii where we have water coming from the mountaintops and extending all the way down to the ocean, and really highlighting the interconnectivity of all of those things in between, and that people had different responsibilities of managing all of those different resources in between, and that's how the culture thrived and had almost the same population that we have now, over 1 million people in the Hawaiian Islands, historically, and surviving and thriving in a sustainable way. Really, one of the other Hawaiian words that really resonates with these concepts is pilina, which really highlights the idea that everything is interconnected, that we are connected to the land is connected to us, and we're connected to each other because of our connections to the land. So really, in English, maybe a synonym, although it's definitely not directly transferable, is reciprocity. The boat that you see here is the hokalea, which is a traditional Hawaiian voyaging canoe that in the past 10 years did a worldwide voyage, Malama Honua, which means to take care of the earth, really sharing about Hawaiian culture globally and stopping in ports all over the world to share some of these ideas of connection and the possibilities of connection. So that's all wonderful and beautiful. But the problem is this, that over the last 100+ years in particular, we've really forgotten about the connection. And not only have we forgotten, we've been force-fed a disconnect. And we've industrialized our world through chopping down trees, through extracting oil, through industrialized farming, to paving over our world. And it obviously has had severe consequences in the places that we live. And I think that this is a big part of that disconnect. And similarly, as was shared earlier, the problems, especially in island nations, are we're actually importing so much of our food, so much of our goods. In Hawaii, it's over 90% of the food that is imported. And simultaneously, we've been force-fed this culture of convenience. This was the cover of Life magazine in 1955 that celebrated this culture of convenience, saying, well, you don't have to do the dishes anymore. You can just throw everything away. And if you go into grocery stores today, it's a very small percentage of the aisles that you find that actually have non-plastic goods. You have to really look hard to find something that's reusable or refillable. And in turn, the really challenging part is we've created this linear system. And what many people still don't know is that plastics are made out of fossil fuels, whether that's oil or from natural gas from fracking, that we do these really destructive practices to create these tiny little pellets, nurdles, which are formed into all the goods that we use on a daily basis. And then we dispose of it. And oftentimes, this is what disposal looks like. While we pretend to talk about recycling and that we're managing our waste well, oftentimes the burden of convenience culture in our developed world is left to be dealt with in countries that don't have the ability to actually do things with this waste in an effective manner. And then we are led to pollution. And I think that in the last talk, if some of you were there, in the Philippines, this was very clear, especially with all this plastic packaging. So I wanted to make that connection too before diving into some of the solutions. So that was all of course, the really the bad stuff. And we have to kind of think about all of those things, obviously, as we get towards thinking about solutions. But there's really an opportunity here. There's an opportunity to reconnect with the world around us. And there's so many different ways to do it. And we'll get into one of the programs that we have here, but I wanted to highlight a few of the others that we work on and why we consider those things to be reconnections. And so this is just a pictured grid of some of the different activities that we do. And like I said, we're known for being a beach cleanup organization. We bring together sometimes thousands of people at a beach cleanup to, of course, remove the debris from our coastlines and from our ecosystems. And while that has huge value, what we really are teaching people at beach cleanups is that we don't want to be cleaning up beaches, that this is a reactive solution. And the true work and the true goals of our organization are to find proactive solutions to stop the pollution before it actually starts. And that starts, as we said in that introductory question, kind of with ourselves, and can expand to small local communities all the way to full-scale government opportunities for change. But what that takes is also education and connectivity. And so we have a robust education program that starts in schools with the youngest of kids and extends all the way up through adult education, wherever we can. And that is where we really talk about what are the proactive solutions to stopping plastic pollution before it starts, so we don't end up with this for our kids' futures, for their kids' futures. Okay, so that's the background. And now the meat of what we wanted to talk about today, and I think is a really unique program that we've been working on now for almost a decade, which is our Sustain Events program. And it used to be just called our Waste Diversion program. And as we've expanded to include more offerings and think a little bit more strategically about the full scope of it, we've renamed it to Sustain Events. And this is just highlighting one of those proactive solutions that we're trying to do to stop the problem before it starts. And I like this picture because this includes some of our newest waste diversion bins. These are wood bins made out of recycled wood by a group called the Albizia Project. And so Albizia is an invasive tree here in Hawaii that is causing huge detrimental problems to our watersheds. And the Albizia Project has found ways to repurpose the wood as we try and remove that invasive species into really interesting new ideas, whether that be small scale homes or, in our case, these beautiful waste diversion bins that highlight a phrase on there, waste as a resource, which will really drive the rest of the conversation that I'm about to share. So the history of this program is really cool in that it started almost a decade ago at two different events. So the Wanderlust Festival, which is a yoga festival on the North Shore of Oahu, and then the Triple Crown of Surfing, which historically, it just changed recently, has been the premier event for the professional surf circuit, ending at the Pipe Masters, where they crown both the pipe champion, but then also the world champion of surfing. And here you see the greatest surfer of all time in many people's minds, Kelly Slater, actually using one of our old waste diversion bins at the event. And so what is Sustain Events and what are we actually trying to do? The ultimate goal is that we want to get to the point where events are zero waste, where in this picture you see the trash opening here in our bin. The end goal, if we're looking towards the future, is that there would be no trash in there and that everything would be repurposed through recycling, compost, or reuse. And so what we do is we work on planning before the event with the event organizers to talk through the materials that are being used at the events and what does their life cycle look like? Is there opportunity to switch out a single-use plastic for something that's better, whether that's a compostable container or a reusable container or no container at all, if possible? And then at the events, we have a team that works to actually divert all the waste into these different sections, talking with the people who are at the events about why we're doing this, and so that they can actually bring those ideas home with them. So that's the idea of setting the example, both for how to host an event, but then also when people leave an event and they've interacted with us, can they translate these things to their own home and reduce the waste that they have on a day-to-day basis? So I want to zoom back out for a second on why we're doing this. And obviously I covered a lot of this in the introduction to who Sustainable Coastlines Hawaii is, but I wanted to refocus on it. So obviously disposable plastics are a major problem in Hawaii and accelerating around the world to the point that we are dumping millions of tons of plastic into the ocean every day, every year. And that's washing up on our beaches. It's now, if you follow the news, yesterday we're saying that we're finding microplastic in human blood. So this is really a universal problem in our scope, and we have to find ways to create systems that don't have such a reliance, especially on the single-use items. If we think about that production systems that I highlighted earlier and what it takes to make these, and then we use something for 1 to 2 minutes and then throw it away. And that's, in my mind, kind of the definition of insanity. So, and beyond that, our other problems are, especially, and this can resonate in island nations around the world, what do we do with the waste when we're done? And there are solutions that have come up that are more of just band-aids, or they cause other problems. So for instance, in Hawaii, this is a picture of our waste to energy plant. We call it H-Power. And in a place that has limited space for landfills, this was thought of as the solution. Oh, we can just burn everything and create energy. And that's a win-win for everybody. And we don't have to use landfills anymore. But of course, the consequences weren't fully thought through. And the problem with this is that there are toxic emissions that are coming out of the smokestacks from H-Power, especially when you burn plastics, which are chock full of so many different types of chemicals. And the ash that is created afterwards is also quite toxic and ends up going to the landfill anyway. So it's really not an end game solution. And in Hawaii, it's actually caused problems for our ability to reduce waste, as we've tried to pass legislation to reduce the actual waste footprint. Our local governments have oftentimes said, well, we need that waste in order to burn to create an energy. So it's created this dependency on creating waste. Another issue that we wanted to address with our program is that the compostable alternatives to plastic. So I'm sure that you've seen these rising around the world as we focus on the problems of plastic. There are a lot of plant-based alternatives. And while it is a step potentially in the right direction, those goods oftentimes don't make it into composting systems, because especially things like PLA, which are the cups, polylactic acid cups, they require an industrial composting facility to break down. You can't just bury them in your backyard and expect them to become compost. So they also end up getting thrown away after a single use. And while using something that's made out of plants is obviously better than oil, it is still part of that same cycle of using something once and throwing it away. So those are the problems, but there are solutions that we've worked on. And I went over some of these things in why we do this work and how we do this work. And the first solution is the pre-event consulting, where we're really talking with the event organizers on the opportunities for change. And again, the second solution is, while we're at an event and we're sorting through these items and helping people to understand, we're really doing an educational program at the same time, where people interact with waste in a new way. They see their own waste in a different way, and they think about that concept of waste as a resource as we continue to discuss with them. And our third solution, which is one of the most exciting pieces about this presentation, and one of my favorite things about this program, is we're starting to look at composting solutions in a microgrid of industrial in-vessel systems, which I'm going to get into, which allows us to take the food waste and the compostable products and turn them into something useful to enrich our soils here in Hawaii, to grow more food here in Hawaii. And that's one of the most exciting pieces about this program, that we're really trying to change the game in how we think of these waste items in Hawaii. And it's starting to work, and it's starting to be able to see the opportunity for true scaling, both here on our islands, but then also as an example for other places around the world. So this is our in-vessel composting machine. And after an event, we're able to take all of the food waste and these compostable alternatives and put them into this machine, which is actually housed in a shipping container, and mitigates a lot of the problems that local governments are concerned about with composting, which is odors and leachate and runoff that comes from compost. There's fire potential. And by containing it into a shipping container, we're able to really solve a lot of those problems. This is on a small farm on the island of Oahu that we were able to receive grant money to put this machine here. And it can process 1,000 pounds a day of a mixture of food waste and green waste, or the mulching materials that come from landscaping and tree trimming, and that beautiful combination of the moisture that comes from food waste and the dry organic waste that comes from landscaping allows for this really incredible nutrient-rich mix. And this machine, by using this auger, this drill that goes back and forth and forward and back, it's aerating the compost. So it is actually an aerobic composting system, which also makes sure that you avoid things like methane release from composting, which are one of the biggest concerns. If you get an anaerobic condition, that the compost really kind of turns sour, it doesn't do what it's supposed to do. So really an incredible piece of technology that could be used at schools, at hotels, on farms, in somebody's backyard if they really wanted to compost on an industrial level in their own home. really scalable solutions. This is in a 20-foot shipping container. It can be done in a 40-foot container. It can be site built to exist on whatever space you need it to exist in. So one of the exciting pieces about our program too is that we really do a lot of data collection on it too. And like I said, our goal is to get this total diversion rate to 100%. But right now, something like 70% at events is an incredible achievement. When we started these events, we were more in the range of 25 to 30% because we hadn't had the opportunity to work with event organizers on a consistent level. And we were still seeing a lot of single-use plastics at events. So this was actually just from the last Triple Crown of Surfing that we reached 70% despite the pandemic coming out of it. And you can see, I mean, 58% was composted, and that's a pretty amazing achievement. Obviously, we want to get this down to zero, and some of the new things that we're thinking of including on this are reusable container programs and partnerships with other organizations like Zero Waste Oahu on the island of Oahu. And we have other partners who have reusable water stations that they can bring to events. So all the event attendees can bring their own water containers. And really there is a possibility that in the very near future that we can get close to zero waste at events. It's also about changing the mindsets. So these are just some other cool metrics from the past year in using our compost machine. We were able to divert 133,000 pounds of organic waste into this little shipping container here. And we also had a solar system that was donated to put on the adjacent building to this machine. So we were able to save 1.81 megawatt hours over the course of half a year by powering this on solar. It doesn't have to be powered on solar, but obviously it closes the loop even more. And the exciting part about compost in a world of climate change also is healthy soils are considered to be one of the most effective ways of drawing CO2 out of the air and back into the ground and uptaken by plants to help with their growth. And you can see the obvious benefits of that in a cycle, and especially in places where we struggle to have enough food on our islands to sustain the populations that live here. So really incredible opportunities. And this is just one small machine. And we think about this as scaling across our islands and across the world. So that's the basics. I'm going to share one last slide and that has some of our information on it, and we'll open it up to questions. There's also a little video on this next slide from Sean, who is our local composter working with this machine on the farm. And he's just an incredible joy to work with and so exuberant about this. So I wanted to end with him showing his excitement for the work that we're doing.
That's the kind of compost we want to make.
What's the kind of compost you want to make?
We want to be able to squeeze it and have it stick together and then easily break it apart. That means it's got good structure. That's ideal right there. Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. Oh, that's good stuff. Look at that. Beautiful. Beautiful.
So, all right. Unshare my screen here.
Great. Thank you so much for that. That excitement was definitely contagious because I'm fired up on compost as well. So we're going to have some questions from the audience here and also some questions coming in online. Just to, I'll start things off again just to get things rolling. And I'm curious to know from you, what are some sort of dream technologies or dream strategies that either haven't been invented yet or haven't been used on a wide scale that you would like to see come into the world that you work in?
Oh, that's a great one. There's a lot that we're trying to figure out with the reuse of plastics or upcycling of plastics, marine plastics. And I don't think that there's things that have happened already with it, but the scalability or the not basically creating the same problems that we already have with plastics is something that's worrisome about taking plastics out of the ocean and then remaking them into something else. They still off-gas methane when they interact with the sun. They still shed microplastics as they interact. So I would love to see the true ability to take the things that we remove off beaches and turn them into useful products without causing more damage.
The question was, how do you keep a positive outlook? I'll try to speak quickly before this thing cuts out.
Yeah, it's a common question, and I think that part of what the presentation at the beginning was that whole idea of connection and making sure that you spend time in the world around you that is so beautiful, and obviously in these wonderful islands that we live in, while we are surrounded by problems and issues, the extraordinary beauty of the natural world inspires me every single day. That's one piece, and then the second piece I will say is because of the educational work that we do, we're interacting with students all the time, and I will say that I think that the next generation, they understand these things on a very high level. Whether it's plastic pollution or climate change, these issues don't seem to be political to them. They seem to be something that they know needs to be solved. So I'm constantly inspired by the generations that are behind us who are ready to work on these issues in full force.
Great. Another question from the audience, and I'll just repeat it from up here. No, but I will repeat your comment from here. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it was an observation from an audience member that when she saw her first plastic plate in the 1940s, the idea was that it would last forever and not be disposable, and an indication of how far we've come, that now plastic is regarded as something that you can just use once and do away with. So it's an interesting change. Okay. Okay, great. Awesome. So another question that I have is, so for you're in Hawaii, you're Hawaii based. For an organization that's in another state or in another country like Bermuda, especially another island nation like Bermuda, what can people who are not experts in this field but are hoping to organize events, what are some things that they can take into consideration? I was looking at your website, and one of the things I thought was really cool was starting by considering the items that are brought onto the site. So if you prevent an item from being brought onto the site, it can't possibly be disposed of on the site. So that was one interesting way of framing it. But I'm curious to know, what are some other things that event organizers in Bermuda or other island nations can take into consideration when planning events?
Yeah, I think that it's really that intentional work up front of understanding where the destination of all the things that you are bringing on site are going to go, and you don't have to be an expert to think about that. I guess is the first step, and then being able to reach out to people who do have understanding of waste streams and finding out what are the alternatives. You can't just tell yourself, okay, I'm just not going to have those if it's going to interrupt the event that you're having. So figuring out from experts or from people who have done this, whether it's reaching out to us, because I think there's so much universality in what happens at events and what items we're bringing in. So reaching out to those who have worked in them, and then getting creative. I mean, even in Hawaii, like depending on the scale of your event, but we have so many banana trees in Hawaii, and you can use banana leaf or the actual corum of the tree if it's ready to be harvested, and use those as plates or bowls. And thinking really outside the box is honestly the first step in seeing what's possible.
Thank you for that. Another question, I'm curious to know, what have been some unexpected outcomes that have come out of your involvement with this work, for you personally or for the organization?
Yeah, I mean the composting has been, I think, one of the biggest ones. When we first started with this work, we were not sure what to do with the food waste, because as you start to scale, composting on a farm in just piles takes a lot of manpower in the sense that you need to be constantly churning it and moving it in order to not cause the problems that could happen with compost. And we worked with a process called bokashi at the beginning. So bokashi is part of a Korean natural farming technique where you use EM, or effective microorganisms, and you put all of your compost into buckets, and the EM powder will actually start to eat away at it and basically pickle the food waste that you have, and then you can bury that under the ground, and the rest of the process happens underground. So really cool, but at the same time, when you think about that as a scaling opportunity, it's really challenging. How do you actually manage that? So being led down the rabbit hole to get to the point where we are, where this machine is made by Green Mountain Technologies. They're out of Washington State, and I never thought in starting this work that part of plastic pollution work was going to be working in soil and soil science, and you see trying to help people draw connections between creating healthy soils and not using plastic was not where I thought it was going to go, but it's actually become one of the most exciting programs that I think we work on.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions from the audience? Yeah.
Give this another try. I think it's all in the wrist, you see. If I hold really steady and don't move my head. Can you hear me, Rafael?
I can hear
Hi.
you, yeah.
I'm Ann Hyde. I'm the current chair of the Marine Debris Task Force for Bermuda. I'm also the former executive director for Keep Bermuda Beautiful. And I was very involved when we hosted America's Cup here. And what you said about avoiding pre-planning, having a lot of planning in place from everyone who's involved, including the vendors, the subcontractors, and making sure that no plastic water bottles were allowed on site, that everyone had to bring an empty water container, and there was a water supply for them to fill up water and so forth. But my question to you is, we don't have any in-vessel commercial composting facilities here. To my knowledge, I don't think the government is planning on installing any. But your example where some farmer has done that seems a low-cost alternative method to do something on a small scale. You say it's in a shipping container, which we have plenty of here. And so I'd be more interested in my question, I guess, is can you tell us more about how that got started?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's the origin story is actually really cool, and I love sharing it because I was on a hike in the valley that I live in with a chef. He's the chef at a local community college, Kapilani Community College, and he was telling me about this thing called the Earth Tub that they had for their culinary program at the community college, and it was very similar to what we have now, and it was made by Green Mountain Technologies. And it had the auger in it, but nobody knew about it. It was happening, and that's also nobody knew about it because there's also lots of issues with permitting on these things in Hawaii. But that's beside the point. And I just got really excited about this potential solution and sought out Green Mountain Technologies, and then started grant writing to figure out how to get one of the in-vessel machines here in Hawaii. And it's not inexpensive, but when we think about the problems with industrial scale waste solutions, we're oftentimes talking about like $1 billion infrastructure project to serve an entire island or an entire community. And that comes with problems of resilience, of really actually creating an effective product in the end. And so I think the opportunity to create a microgrid where it's really decentralized, you reduce on transport costs across islands, and you can really work in different types of communities. The costs for these have unfortunately gone up pretty significantly over the last 2 years because stainless steel has become so expensive. So the starting cost for these is probably around $80,000 for the 20-foot shipping containers. I'm working with the company to try and do some scaling opportunities specifically here in Hawaii, where we basically order the kits and try and put them together with local welders and metal workers here in Hawaii, so that we can both create jobs here and then lower some of the costs of production that happen on the mainland United States. So there's lots of opportunities, and I think that there's lots of groups out there, funders, who want to see composting and soil health be elevated by nonprofits and by local governments. And so there's funding out there to at least do this on pilot project scales. And I assume that once we start showing the return on investment in terms of healthy compost that's locally produced, that it will be able to scale even more.
If other people have questions, I don't want to hog the mic, but I'm interested in gather my thoughts here. Can you still hear me, Rafael? I'm trying to do the wrist thing again. It's how have you been successful in avoiding greenwashing? There's so many brands and things marketed that have these crazy names like biodegradable or compostable, when they really are not backyard degradable at all, and so not degrading or not being suitable for the event.
Yeah, that's a great question, because I mean, sadly, all of these products are a type of greenwashing, because as I mentioned in the talk, that single use is not the answer, no matter what the constitution of the actual material is. So to use something once and throw it away is not sustainable, because you think about all the energy and water that went into, whether it's a compostable or a fossil fuel based product, it still took so much effort to create it, and then that we throw it away. So that's our primary messaging. Always there have been a lot of legislative moves to make sure that some of the greenwashing is mitigated, in the sense that the concepts of biodegradable versus compostable have become cloudy, and so compostable is now, there's an ASTM 6400 standard, which means that it is actually compostable, which it will break down back into soil, whereas biodegradable oftentimes means that it will just break up into smaller and smaller pieces. A lot of biodegradable plastics are actually mostly corn or sugarcane based, but they're bound by plastic. So then you end up creating microplastics in the breakdown. And then what's also happened a lot is really nasty chemicals like PFAS were being used as the water barrier in these compostable alternatives. And fortunately, there are new standards that eliminate those. But in the grand scheme of things, a lot of these products, they're still made by Dow Chemicals or DuPont, and there's proprietary binding materials that are inside of them that we don't even know what they are. And so that's actually part of our project too, in that as we're breaking down some of these materials, once we get permitted for it, we're going to be testing the soil afterwards to see, are these really viable as something that can help soil, or are we going to be hurting soil by having a toxic compost that comes out the other end? So I'm excited that we're going to be able to do some of the work in revealing some of those things.
What is your response to someone who argues that plastic's cheaper, especially being in Bermuda when most things are incredibly expensive? That seems to be a pretty popular response.
Yeah, I mean, it's a powerful commentary that the plastics industry has moved forward and spends billions of dollars lobbying to tell that story. And I would say, I mean, if you look at the beginning of this presentation and what the damage being done by plastics are, and if we think about plastics as oil, then there's no way that we can actually call these things cheap. There's been studies done. The NRDC in California talked about how much money it costs to clean up plastic alone just in storm drains and beach cleanups. And it was $500 million annually across coastal cities in California. And so San Diego County, which is similar to the population of Hawaii, spends about 14 or 15 million a year in cleaning storm drains and beaches. And so the cost is actually put back on the consumer through taxpayer dollars, oftentimes to clean it up. And I don't know if I had it in one of my slides, but we give out $5.4 trillion in oil subsidies every year to make, this is globally, to make oil seem cheap. And obviously it's not cheap. Both the upfront consequences of extraction, transport to get things places, and then the detriments downstream afterwards that oftentimes are exported outside of the United States into poorer countries. It's one of the biggest lies that's been perpetrated, I think, on people across the world, of saying that this is a cheap product. And sorry, I'll add one more thing there too, just that one of the things we've run into in trying to ban certain types of plastics is that same thing that restaurants will say, oh, but it's going to cost us more for the alternatives. Well, that might be true at the moment. And at the same time, like the real goal is teaching people, like, bring your own everything. And then it's not cheaper. If people start bringing their own utensils, their own straws, their own bowls, whatever, fill in the blank, then the restaurant doesn't have to buy anything. And so the disposable nature of things is actually quite expensive because you have to keep buying it over and over and over and over again. But if we start really moving back towards reusable, then it's far cheaper in the long run.
I'll, as a follow-up to what you just said, just close with one last question, which is what sort of strategies have you seen be successful in achieving that change, which sounds more like a cultural or behavioral change rather than an event level planning sort of change?
Yeah, ultimately, I think that we're stuck in that culture of convenience that I've talked about, and I think that the education level, there's constant awareness building, and idea, like when we host a beach cleanup, our goal is to get as many people there, not so that we have so many hands to clean the beaches, but that we have so many people in a community that are connecting with each other to understand the concepts that are required in order to make the changes that we have that are necessary in front of us. And the more stories that are told together, that radiates out. And if we have 2,000 people at a beach cleanup and every one of them tells 5 friends about their experience, ultimately, I think that that's where we have to think about change in these social levels, that we will reapply the pressure back towards the people who are producing the goods, the governments that are regulating the goods, and say, we don't want this anymore. And that's why I also have the positive outlook of inspiration, is that I think that the generations that are coming into decision-making power, into buying power, that reusable is in. It's a trend that's going to happen. It's unfortunately the generations that have existed that have been lulled into it over decades that are struggling to relinquish that reliance on convenience. But I hope and I believe that change is coming from the generations that are coming into power.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Rafael. Thank you for sharing how Sustainable Coastlines Hawaii has developed sustainable ocean strategies for event waste management. It is our hope that your presentation inspires and encourages discussions throughout Bermuda and other island communities.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. It's always great to connect outside of just our own bubbles too. So I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to a brand new audience and share what we're doing here.
Thank you also to Chubb Bermuda, sponsor of BUEI Talks Island SOS series. Join us next month, April 24th at 4 p.m. when the focus shifts to Jamaica with Dr. Teresa Rodriguez Moody, CEO of JET, Jamaica Environmental Trust. My name is Dreas, and I'll see you next time. Thank you.